Hey everybody, we're going to go through another lesson of community property. We're going to go through creditors' rights. We're going to talk about what rights creditors have when it boils down to getting their money from the married couple and what rights they have when it comes down to getting separate property from either spouse when they're trying to get their money back from the person who incurred certain debts in their life. Our outline boils down to these four brief things. We're going to first go through what does debt include and when is it incurred. Then we'll go through debt liability. That'll be the general rule that we'll go through. And then we'll go through the four exceptions to debt liability, because as you know, in law, you have your general rule, and for every single rule there is, there are exceptions. So we'll go through the four exceptions, and we'll finally conclude and talk about the next lesson, the next issue that we'll go through in the next video. What does debt include and when is it incurred? Debt can technically include through contract, by tort, or other obligations such as child support or spousal support. So let's say that someone got married, then they divorced that person, then they have a second marriage. They may still have spousal support that they're liable to pay back, right? So that's an example of spousal support. Or the person had a child in their prior marriage, then they get married a second time. Even though they got married a second time, they will still be liable for that child support. Just an example. Debt is incurred at the time when the contract is incurred, when the tort is made, or other obligation incurs like child or spousal support. And a tort, like we all know, can be a car crash and you're sued for negligence and you got to pay certain fees. But that'll be a situation where debt will be incurred. And debt liability technically lasts during the marriage alone. So if the marriage dissolves, then there's no debt liability when it comes down to creditors be able to reach into community property funds. The overall general rule for debt liability under the law is that the community estate is liable for debt incurred before and during marriage by either spouse. A spouse's separate property is liable for his or her own debt, which means that if one spouse comes into the marriage with $5,000 in certain debt, that spouse's separate property will be liable for his or her own debt. But the creditors do have a right to reach into community property funds first. And if that's exhausted, then the creditors can go into the spouse's separate property who incurred that debt. But the other spouse won't be liable for it in regards to their separate property. So their separate property funds are completely safe, but the spouse who incurred the debt will not be safe. Perfect example of debt liability and when it's incurred is that in 2011, Emily and Jacob get married. Congrats. Before marriage, Emily incurred $5,000 in credit card debt. So she comes to the marriage with $5,000 in debt. She has to pay it back, right? In 2012, a creditor can reach, this is completely lawful, they can reach into Emily and Jacob's community property funds. And then once it's exhausted, let's say the creditor only took $3,000 of community property funds because that's all they had left in regards to community property, then that creditor can reach into Emily's separate funds to get the last bit of money that they need in order to get the $5,000 that they desire. But Jacob's separate property funds, his personal money that he had before marriage or by gift or bequest, is completely safe. So he will never be liable for his separate property for the $5,000 that Emily incurred. Now let's go to the four exceptions of debt liability: necessaries of life, child and spouse support, tort obligations, and living separate and apart. This sounds like Japanese, but trust me, we'll put it into complete English and we'll make it very simple. The necessities of life. This is the easiest one, in my opinion. A married person is personally liable for debt incurred from necessaries of life while the spouses are living together during the marriage or living apart before divorce. So a spouse will be personally liable, which means that a spouse's community property and separate property will be personally liable for the other spouse's necessities of life, such as food, water, and shelter and clothing. And basically, these are needed in order to sustain life. So as long as the spouse uses that certain debt for necessities of life, you, the other spouse, will be liable for it as well. Your separate income party will be liable for it too, as long as it's for necessaries. Let's go through child and spousal obligations. This is the other exception to the rule. It's that child or spousal support obligations of a married person that does not arise out of the marriage of the other spouse shall be treated as debt incurred before the marriage. Let's go through a clear example. An example of child and spousal obligations is that in 2011, Trey Songz had a baby with his baby mama. So let's say he incurred that right before he got married. In 2022, he got married to Vanessa Hudgens. Good for you, man. She's hot. Their community property will be liable for child support that he is going to owe his baby mama, because he got the baby before marriage. And to be liable for the next 18 years of child support, as we all know. Therefore, even though he had the baby before marriage, that is still technically like a loan per se that he has to pay back until the baby's 18 years old. So his community property funds will be first liable for the support. And then once that's exhausted, his separate property, Trey Songz' separate property, will be liable for whatever is left if the community property funds are exhausted. So Vanessa has the option to shield her earnings to prevent that debt because, again, she didn't incur it, he did. Another exception is tort obligations. The rule of order of satisfaction is applicable to all tort claims. Therefore, it's important to understand this rule and to memorize it. These two points here is that if the liability is based on an act or omission that occurred during an activity for the benefit of the community, let's say that the husband is driving to work to use his hourly pay to pay the rent, that is a situation where that's an activity where it's for the benefit of the community. Then the liability that the husband would probably have to pay back because he got into a car crash will be first satisfied from community property funds and then from his separate property funds once the community property funds are exhausted. However, if no benefits of the community is shown, so let's say that husband was driving to his friend's house for a beer to hang out and watch a football game, that's not for the benefit of the community, right? Therefore, his separate property will be liable for the car crash first, and then the creditor will go after the community property funds. And I want you to note that the separate property of the tortfeasor is liable, and the separate property of the other spouse is free from liability because the other spouse, let's say the wife, did not get into the car crash. She was not negligent. He was. Therefore, his separate property will be attacked first rather than hers. So she's free from liability. An example of a tort obligation is that Riley is married to Selena Gomez. Riley gets into a car accident on the way to work. All of the act of negligence itself is not for the benefit of the community. This act of negligence, the car crash, happened while Riley was performing an activity for the benefit of the community, right? Trying to earn money on his way to work for the benefit of paying rent, clothes, and food for his family. Therefore, the liability, basically the creditors, to be able to reach Riley and Selena Gomez's community property funds. And once that's exhausted, once all the community property funds are exhausted, then the creditors can go after Riley's separate property. The other exception is living separate and apart is another key exception to liability in debt. So a married person is personally liable for debt incurred for common necessaries of life. Like I said before, it's very similar to the necessaries of life that we discussed before. So basically, the policy reasons for this, the reason why this is even a rule in the first place under the law, is that a spouse technically has a duty of support until the marriage is completely over. So once the divorce is finalized, then the spouse is free from incurring any type of debt for necessity that the other spouse will technically need to survive. And the second reason is that no spouse should be deprived of the barest necessities of life. So basically, when you're married to somebody, you're pretty much on the hook for their necessities of life because they need to live. You marry that person, you're going to basically finish off the care for that person until the divorce is finalized. An example of this is that in 1992, Bobby Brown and Whitney Houston got married. In 2006, they decided to divorce and they are separated apart. In 2007, the marriage dissolves. So that means that between the moment of being separated apart and the moment of the marriage being dissolved, the moment of the finalizing of the divorce, Bobby will be liable for Whitney's necessities of life, and Whitney will be liable for Bobby's necessities of life. Overall, that's it. It's pretty straightforward. So again, be very careful when you're bringing debt into a marriage because more than likely you're going to be liable for it. But again, the creditors will have the right to reach the earnings that you and your spouse have earned together during the marriage. So the creditors can go after that. So even if you're somebody who married another person and then next year become this famous doctor, let's say, and you're making six figures, that's community funds, right? So the creditors can go after the money you earned during marriage, and that money will be exhausted first in regards to a tort obligation or a credit card debt loan. And then they'll go after the other spouse as separate property. So your inheritance, your property that you acquired before marriage is safe, but anything that you make during the marriage is pretty much on the hook because your other spouse has loans or some type of debt that they have to pay back. So the next lesson will be about transmutations. That'll be about basically transforming one's separate property into community property or transforming one's community property into separate property. So we'll go through that next. Okay.